Pick a building, not a famous one. The one on your street with the dry cleaner on the ground floor and 11 apartments above it. The one you have walked past 4,000 times. Now try to find out who owns it. Depending on your county, you will get somewhere. Property records will hand you a name, and in a lot of places, you can pull it up online in a few minutes. Say the name that comes back is something like 1422 Holdings Limited Liability Company. I am making that one up, but you have seen 100 like it. And that is where the trail stops being a trail and starts being a wall, because a name like that is not a person. State filings will usually give you a registered agent, which is a company whose entire business is receiving mail for other companies. Behind it, there might be a dentist 2 towns over. Or another company, which is owned by another company. You can keep clicking, and in most states, the clicking never resolves into a human being. For about 15 months, there was one place in this country where that question had an answer written down. An actual file. Almost every small corporation and limited liability company in America, tens of millions of them, had to say out loud, in a federal system, which flesh and blood human beings were really behind it. You were never allowed to open that file. Not for one day of those 15 months. And as of today, the American half of it is scheduled to be deleted. So this is not a story about losing access to something. You never had access. This is a story about what happens to the only copy of an answer when the last people who were allowed to read it decide they would rather not keep it. The law is called the Corporate Transparency Act, and it is a strange piece of legislation for one specific reason. Nobody campaigned on it, and it was never a standalone bill. Its formal name is Title 64 of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2021. It wrote into law bolted to the annual defense budget on the first day of January 2021. What it did was add a brand new section to the Bank Secrecy Act. In the United States Code, it lives at Title 31, Section 5336. And the thing it created has a dull name that everything else here hangs on, so hold on to it. Beneficial ownership information. Beneficial ownership is a phrase lawyers use to separate two ideas that most people assume are the same idea. There is the name on the paperwork, and then there is the human being underneath it. The statute defines that second person 2 ways, and you need both. Someone who holds a large enough ownership interest in the company, or someone who exercises substantial control over it, whether or not they own a share of anything. Usually the paperwork name and the real one are the same person. In the specific corner of the economy this law was aimed at, they are deliberately not. The act told the Treasury to build a system where both would have to be written down together. Now the Treasury does not build systems. It delegates. The job went to a bureau of the Department of the Treasury that most Americans have never heard of, called the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which everyone in the business shortens to FinCEN. On the 30th of September 2022, FinCEN published the rule that turned the statute into an actual obligation. It went into the Federal Register with a file number and an effective date, and the effective date was the 1st of January 2024. That is the day the portal opened. That is the day the answer started existing. So what did a company actually have to hand over? For each beneficial owner, full legal name, date of birth, current residential address, and an identifying number from an acceptable document, along with an image of that document, a passport, a driver's license. There was a shortcut, which is that an individual could get a personal FinCEN identifier once and then let companies reference that number instead of resubmitting everything each time. But somebody had to put the underlying documents in at least once. So, not a checkbox, not a form where you tick, yes, someone owns this. A photograph of a real identity document attached to a company sitting on a federal server. How many companies? FinCEN's own analysis, published inside the original rule, put it at 32,556,929 reporting companies in 2024, plus roughly 5 million brand new entities every single year after that. That is not a sample of American business. In practical terms, that is American business, minus the big public companies and the banks and the nonprofits and the large operating firms, all of which were carved out because they already report to somebody. By the time the first big change hit, about 15 million of those reports had actually come in. 15 million. Everything after this hangs on that number, so slow down on it. 15 million filings assembled in about 15 months, most of them carrying at least one real human name, one real birth date, one real home address, and one photographed government identity document. There has never been anything like it in this country. A census counts people. A tax roll records who paid. This was the first time the federal government tried to write down, entity by entity, who was actually in charge. You could not look at it. Not hard to look at. Not gated behind a good reason, or a lawyer, or a form you had to fill in. There was a separate federal rule published 3 days before Christmas in 2023 called Beneficial Ownership Information Access and Safeguards, and its entire job was to name who is allowed to touch the file. It named 5 categories: federal agencies doing national security, intelligence, or law enforcement work, state, local, and tribal law enforcement, but only if a court of competent jurisdiction signs off first, in an actual criminal or civil investigation. Certain foreign authorities coming in through a federal channel. Financial institutions for customer due diligence and only with the reporting company's consent. And the regulators who supervise those financial institutions. Read that list again and notice who is not on it. You are not on it. Journalists are not on it. Neither is the tenant trying to work out who to serve papers on, nor a city council trying to find out who owns the 11 vacant lots on the same block. A small business owner wondering whether the company suing him is the same one that sued his competitor last year, not on it. Your county assessor, not on it. Even the local police detective could not just pull it up. He had to go to a judge first. So, for the whole 15 months, the answer to who owns the building existed in one place, checked against a photograph of an identity document. And the door was open only to those 5 categories: investigators, supervised banks, and the agencies that watch the banks. Not to the public in any form, ever. That is a strange thing to build. And I think it explains almost everything about what happened next, because a system that costs a lot of people something and visibly benefits almost nobody they can see is a system with very shallow roots. Here is what it cost. FinCEN's own estimate in the original rule was a weighted average of $665.71 per report. Some of that is time. Some of it is the accountant or the lawyer you call because the definition of substantial control is not obvious, and the penalty for getting it wrong is not small. Multiply that by tens of millions of small entities. The agency's own arithmetic put the annual filing burden at roughly 53 million hours and roughly $9 billion a year. 53 million hours. I keep coming back to that number because you can actually picture it. Picture a florist, a 2-truck plumbing outfit, and a guy with 3 rental units under a limited liability company his brother-in-law set up in 2019, all trying to work out on a Sunday night whether they count as a beneficial owner of their own business. And essentially, none of them are laundering anything. That is the honest tension in this whole story, and pretending it away would be dishonest, because the moment you pretend it away, you have stopped explaining and started campaigning. The list that would catch the anonymous owner had to be built by making tens of millions of ordinary businesses each hand over a photograph of somebody's identity document. There was no version where only the suspicious ones filed. That is not how a registry works. So it got challenged, repeatedly and in several places at once. In December of 2024, a federal district court in Texas issued an order that stopped the government enforcing the act nationwide and froze the deadlines. A month later, a second Texas court did something similar for the parties in front of it. Both freezes were then put on hold within about 6 weeks, one of them by the nation's highest court and the other by the same judge who had granted it. Judges in Alabama and Michigan had already issued narrower orders of their own. The whole thing spent a winter switching on and off like a bad hallway light, while millions of small companies tried to work out whether a deadline they had been warned about for 2 years still existed. Then, on the 2nd of March, 2025, the Treasury stopped waiting for the courts. It announced it would suspend enforcement against American citizens and domestic reporting companies, and said plainly that it intended to rewrite the rule so that only foreign companies had to report. 24 days later, it did exactly that. On the 26th of March, 2025, FinCEN published an interim final rule. Interim final is a real category, and it means what it sounds like, which is This is in force right now. We will hear objections afterwards. It took effect the day it was published. And what it did was surgical. It did not touch the statute. It could not touch the statute because Congress writes statutes and agencies do not. What it did instead was reach for a lever the statute itself had installed. Buried in the Corporate Transparency Act, on a long list of exemptions, is a clause letting the Secretary of the Treasury exempt any entity or any whole class of entities from reporting. If the Secretary determines that collecting their information would not serve the public interest and would not be highly useful to national security and law enforcement. It sits at item 24 on that list. One line. The Secretary used it to exempt an entire class, and the class was the one the rules had called domestic reporting companies. Every company formed in an American state that had been required to file. The law that required almost everyone to report was still on the books, word for word, unamended. It simply now applied to almost no one. Now, an interim final rule has to be finished. You publish it, you take comments, and then you either adopt it, change it, or withdraw it. FinCEN got 118 comment letters. 40 were clearly in favor. 28 were strongly opposed. 50 did not clearly land on either side. The people writing in were small business owners, trade groups, law firms, law enforcement agencies, transparency organizations, a sitting Secretary of State of a U.S. state, and several sitting U.S. senators. And the single most common request from the side that liked the change had nothing to do with reporting. They wanted to talk about the 15 million filings already sitting on the server. Delete them, the letters said. Delete mine. Give me a way to ask. Some pointed out the obvious privacy problem. A set of information that is no longer required to be collected is still being retained. Others made a security argument, which is that a single federal database holding millions of verified identity documents linked to business ownership is an extraordinarily attractive target, and every day it exists intact is a day it can be stolen. FinCEN sat on that question for 16 months, and on the 11th of August, 2026, it answered it. The final rule came out that Tuesday. 2 days later, on the 13th of August at 8:45 in the morning Eastern Time, 66 pages of it went on public inspection at the Federal Register under document number 2026-16576. It was published and became effective on the 14th. 3 changes matter here. The domestic exemption becomes permanent. So this is no longer interim, no longer provisional, no longer awaiting comment. The exemption reaches further than the interim rule did, so Americans are also exempt from being named as company applicants on the foreign filings that remain, and Americans holding a FinCEN identifier no longer have to keep it current. And the rule finally answers the letters. Here is how it answers them. FinCEN says it will delete the American data, not that it has, that it will. It says it expects to work with the National Archives and Records Administration, and to identify who to delete by reading the filings themselves, looking for any individual whose attached identity document the agency reasonably believes belongs to an American. A U.S. passport, a U.S. driver's license, those records come out. The rule says it will be done in a single sweep. That is close to the wording in the document itself. One sweep of the database, not a regular periodic sweep. You will not be told individually. FinCEN says explicitly that it does not intend to provide any acknowledgement or confirmation to any company or any person that their information was deleted. It will post a notice on its own website when the sweep is finished, and that general notice is the entirety of what anybody gets. You cannot ask. The agency says it does not anticipate requiring or requesting that anybody contact them to have their data removed, and it happens exactly once. The rule sets a line 180 days after publication. If American ownership information ends up in a filing after that line, whether by mistake or on purpose, FinCEN says it does not anticipate deleting it. The sweep goes through and then the door closes behind it. Commenters asked for more than that. They asked for a notice to every filer confirming their record was gone. They asked FinCEN to publish its retention schedule and the method of the purge. One asked for an annual audit by the Comptroller General to verify the destruction actually happened. One asked FinCEN to report monthly in writing to the Secretary until the destruction was complete. FinCEN turned all of it down, and gave a reason worth stating fairly, because it is not an unreasonable reason. None of those proposals, it said, further the core mission of protecting privacy and information security by deleting information the agency should not retain. The paperwork of proving a deletion is not the deletion, which is true as far as it goes. It also means that a removal on this scale will run without individual confirmation, without a published method, and without the independent audit the commenters asked for, ending in one line on a government webpage. So what is actually left in the building? Foreign companies, entities formed under the law of another country that have registered to do business in an American state. They still file and they still name their owners, except that any American among those owners now comes off the form. By the end of 2025, FinCEN had received about 13,000 of those filings. It expects the eventual population to be somewhere around 28,000, with roughly 15,000 existing foreign companies still to come in and about 1,800 new ones a year. 13,000. Set that against 15 million, and you can see the shape of what the file has become. It is a far narrower thing now. Reports from qualifying foreign entities, arriving at about 100 filings a month, averaging 1.2 owners each. Half of them name a single person. About a quarter name no owner at all on the form, because under the revised rule there was no non-American owner they were required to name. Those companies still have owners. The form just no longer asks about them. And the savings are real, which I have to say plainly. Roughly 27.5 million companies have been let off. Using its own $665 per filing figure, the agency estimates that at something like $18 billion in compliance costs those businesses will not incur. It puts the drop in annual paperwork at something like 53 million hours. Call that a rounding error, and you are not being serious. Those are the agency's own numbers, and by the standards of American rulemaking, they are enormous. The question the rule never has to answer, because rules do not have to answer it, is what the $18 billion bought. There is one door still open, and it is the door closest to the building on your street. 2 years ago, in August of 2024, FinCEN issued a completely separate rule on residential real estate. It is aimed at one specific transaction: a house or an apartment building bought without a mortgage, transferred not to a person, but to a company or a trust. In those cases, somebody in the closing has to file a report naming the beneficial owner of the entity that is buying. Transfers to an actual human being are not covered. The rule was published with an effective date of the 1st of December, 2025. And I am telling you what the document says rather than what its enforcement looks like this morning, because those are different questions. FinCEN built that rule on evidence it had been collecting since 2016, using targeted orders that forced title insurance companies in selected metropolitan areas to report all cash purchases above a price threshold by legal entities. The agency's own conclusion in the preamble was that what came back demonstrated the need for something permanent and nationwide. So the moment of purchase still gets written down, and it goes into a report that only investigators can read. What ends is the standing obligation on the company itself, year after year, to keep saying who is behind it. Go back to the building with the dry cleaner for a second, and look at the actual shape of what changed today. Nothing about your street looks different. The dry cleaner opens at 7. The rent is what the rent is. Nobody took $1 out of your pocket this morning, and if a video tells you otherwise, it is selling you something. The loss here is a strange, thin, almost invisible kind of loss, and it is this. For a period of about 15 months, there existed a place where the true answer was written down for millions of companies that had never had to give it before. Not all of them. 15 million filings out of an expected 32 million is under half. But it was the closest this country has ever come. The public never got to read any of it. That is the part that gets me. 15 million filings went in, most of them carrying somebody's identity document, at a compliance cost the government itself measures in the billions. The file was built, and then it was decided that the thing was not worth keeping, and the emptying of it will happen with nobody outside the agency in a position to confirm it happened. The statute is still there. Section 5336 is still law. Every sentence Congress wrote in 2021 about anonymous companies and national security is still sitting in the United States Code, untouched, describing a reporting system that no longer collects anything from any American company. The building is still standing. It is the filing cabinets that are going out. And the lever is still there too, which is the detail I would carry out of this. One line, item 24 on a list of exemptions. Inside a law written to end anonymous ownership. It says the Secretary may exempt a class of entities. It turns out a class of entities can be defined widely enough to cover essentially all of them. So let me ask you for something, and it is not the usual thing. Most countries have wrestled with this exact question in the last decade, and they landed in very different places. Some built a register and made it fully public. Others built one, and then a court told them to close it again. Plenty never built one at all. I have a rough idea of the map, and I am fairly sure my rough idea is wrong in at least 3 places. So tell me where you are and tell me which one your country did. Can you personally from your laptop look up who really owns a company registered where you live? Yes or no, and the country. I want to see how the map actually looks when it is filled in by people who have tried it, rather than by somebody like me reading about it.